In 1981, the French journalist and documentarian Christophe de Ponfilly made his first trip to Afghanistan, where he befriended the charismatic Massoud, then a leader of the fight against the Soviet invasion and later a fierce opponent of the Taliban. The Frenchman returned 8 times to capture on film this remarkable hero. In 1998, the documentary Massoud the Afghan appeared and won multiple international awards. In 2001, shortly before 9/11, Massoud was assassinated. Canapé offers an excerpt from the documentary, which is now available in the USA.
The 1st of July 1997. This plane is about to leave Pakistan for Afghanistan, where it often treated war as an adventure. Mirabuddin, my faithful interpreter, had agreed to run new risks. Bertrand, a friend, a graduate of the École Normale, a history teacher and former member of the French Parliament, was going to do the sound recording. I'd bought an amateur camcorder to avoid any trouble with the Pakistani police. Mirabuddin had said, Inshallah. He'd said it all. After a detour through the north and various wanderings too long to recount, we finally took off in this sort of flying coffin, the only way to get to Massoud's last stronghold of resistance, the valley of Panjshir. This was my 8th trip to Afghanistan. I'd promised myself never to come back, but I'd dreamt too much of this country at peace. I'd admired and supported Massoud too much to resign myself to reading in the newspapers that he was lost, surrounded by the Taliban. Ammunition arrives to go on killing and wounding. Not enough, say the commanders. 2.5 miles from the Taliban positions, everyone pitches in. The road has been restored. Nobody knows when or how the operation will be launched. One day we hear that it's been cancelled, the next that it's been postponed. Massoud alone will decide. He never stops working. He has to do everything himself. He wants to recapture the capital, Kabul, this poisoned fruit which lures in spite of all its dangers. Pictures filmed by my friend Laurent come back to me of Afghans fighting in the ruins, fighting for heaps of stones without understanding why.
Why? There is fights. Why?
Why? Why? War in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan, I don't know why. There is between commander. You are soldiers.
این امردین قماندان امردین است که شهید شدد. این بچه آیت الله جان نام داشت، توپچی بود، شهید شدد. این عزمالدین است، فعلا موجود است، این شهید شدد. این فعلا موجود است. این پالمان آقا شیرین قماندان بود در گلوار، این شهید شدد. این قماندان غلام محمد فعلا در خط از جنگ داره با طالبا. این برادر ما شهید شده، این هم شهید شده، این ضابط آقا گل است. اینی برادر شهید شده، اینی برادر شهید شده، این شهید شده، این شهید شده، اینی شهید شده، این شهید شده، شهید شده، شهید شده، شهید شده، شهید شده. اینی را که می‌بینی قماندان احمدی است. فعلا زنده است. دنیمی چیزی که تابلویی که می‌بینید، یعنی چند نفر زنده است، کلی شهید شده.
What this child thought was a stone was in fact an anti-personnel mine. To stop the hemorrhaging, his father covered the wound with mud. Frederick, Evelyn and Bertrand, the AMI doctors, did what they could, but the gangrene had gone too far. This scene I will never forget. That's what happens when you get too close to the unbearable. Shouldn't you have gone abroad, I asked him. You'd have been applauded by the American Congress. That's the way the world is these days. Politics is sold like washing powder. Shouldn't you have learned to speak English? You would have appeared on every television station, and who knows, you might have changed the course of history. Night had fallen. Massoud the Afghan smiled, and then he went away. In August 1998, the Taliban took control of nearly all the rest of Afghanistan. Yet Massoud doggedly went on resisting. But he's surrounded now and very much alone. Indeed, I only hope he'll still be alive when this film is shown. Afghanistan, a distant country, far away at war, and who could care?
There's great pleasure in adventuring around the world, but there's also much to be said for staying at home. The French painter Pierre Boulez might be called the greatest artist who stayed at home, a fact that caused his reputation some problems during his lifetime. The current exhibit, Pierre Boulez, Early and Late, defends his intimisme and demonstrates the virtues and continuity of his aesthetic. Art historian Judy Sund tells Canapé about the accomplishment of this master of color and composition in intimate spaces.
Essentially, Bonnard was a child of the 19th century, born in 1867, and participated in movements that are really late 19th century movements. He becomes very interested in Impressionism, though he started out as someone who was also very interested in Japonisme. So as an artist of the early 20th century, he's someone who's really very grounded in the 19th century. But I would compare him to someone like Matisse, who's very interested in the pleasures of domestic life, food, wine, flesh, just very ornamental, beautiful painting, but one that harks back to Impressionism in its colorism and its texture, and not quite so abstract as someone like Matisse. And I think what this exhibition tries to do, as the title indicates, is draw comparisons between the early and the late, and to show that there's really a continuity of interest in Bonnard's work. The other thing that it tries to do is bring together the various media in which Bonnard worked, and to show, give us a more complete picture of his creative endeavors, not just in the graphic arts or in painting, but also book illustrations, theater work that he did, and now also these pretty much unknown photographs were taken by Bonnard. So it gives us a richer view of Bonnard. So it's Bonnard has, I think, most accurately been called an intimist, along with his very good friend Vuillard, both of them because they withdrew into the domestic sphere and focused on that. And Bonnard does, I think, engage the domestic interior as an arena of eroticism, though it's a very sort of quiet, I would even venture to say middle-class eroticism. Focused mainly on his longtime lover and eventual wife, Marthe, whom he met in the early 90s, and photographed and painted. They were married not until 1925, but they lived together until her death in the 1940s. I think the eroticism is of a very subtle and almost natural day-to-day kind. In the bath, doing fairly routine things. I think in the 90s, Bonnard really captures a sort of fin de siècle interest in nightlife and entertainment. We get a sense of the fashionable street life of Paris in his work. In later years, he turns away from the street. And I think there what we see is at least a lifestyle that I think Americans associate with France, and that is one in which there is an aestheticization of even the most basic things, the way that the fruit is arranged in the fruit basket, the way that the baguette lays on the table, the beautiful checked tablecloth. This attentiveness to visual pleasure in even the most mundane situations, I think, is something that, for us at least, calls up the richness of the French lifestyle in its aesthetic value. So it tells us about that. It also tells us about the retreat from the city and this desire to carve out a country space for oneself, which is certainly common at the end of the 19th century in France. He oftentimes then is said to go through an impressionist phase after 1910 when he embraces color and texture. And I would say he's not an impressionist in his late work. He's much more like Matisse, than is commonly thought, I think. And Bonnard is someone who's also very funny. And I think not enough is made of the very witty aspects of Bonnard's art. He's an essentially very amusing, very worldly person, and that shouldn't be overlooked in his work. You should really enjoy the humor that I think is built into them.
What happens when a teenager in the Bronx starts reading the French poet Rimbaud? In one case, he grows up to be the American writer Frederick Tootin, who has set 4 of his playful, verbally rich postmodern novels in France. Francophile Frederick visits with Canapé to talk about his most recently acclaimed novel, The Green Hour, and to describe his enduring fascination with the City of Light and its history.
I became interested in France and in French culture, first through Rimbaud. When I was 15, I was a young boy in the Bronx. I was sort of reading everything that I suppose wasn't to be read. And Rimbaud's extraordinary career, that fascinated me. When you're 15, of course, it's the most romantic thing in the world to think of a poet of 17 writing revolutionary, world-shattering poetry, and then doing all these extraordinary things, living in cafes, and it seemed to me just the height of life, everything I would wish for. So that began my adventure with French culture, with French literature and French painting, French art, and it never left me. It never left me. I'm fascinated by the French Revolution, not just in the Revolution as an overthrow of a certain kind of institution, but in the Revolution as and all its collateral interests, its interest in painting, for example, the French Revolution, and its real attempt to sort of make a state painting, kind of the first time we could have experienced the state interfering with a work of art where before patrons did, or the king did, I suppose. One day, I was reading in the Encyclopedia Britannica, I came across this extraordinary young man, Jean Lambert Tallien. He was amazing because I had never heard about him. Of course, we all knew about the famous ones. We knew Robespierre, we knew Marat, we knew Danton, but not this young guy. His example fascinated me, a kind of hot-headed revolutionary, or an early regicide. And I began to imagine him, and I started writing a story about him, which then later became a novel. And it's about a young man who is an ardent revolutionary, who falls in love, and he did in fact fall in love with an aristocratic woman, and take her out of the prisons and live with her and take her friends out of the prisons. And in a certain sense, depending on what your point of view is, he either betrayed the revolution or did something noble to help people in trouble. I leave that open to everyone. Then I did a novel after Tallien called Tintin in the New World, Tintin. And of course he's Belgian, but I think the French claim him entirely. I don't think the Belgians have a chance there. I saw this young Tintin creature, this strange boy, this sexless boy, as a person who would eventually grow up and become a fully developed man, and in fact become more than that, become an extraordinary man. Something in the challenge of his wish to do good. I wanted to see how far that would go. So I have him fall in love in the heights of Machu Picchu with characters from the Magic Mountain, with one, Claudia Chauchat. The Tintin book took me a very long time, but it sort of centered me again in the French culture, in the French literature. Van Gogh's Bad Café, of course, he's not French, but his life is France. His work is France. Everything that happened that was important is in France, including his suicide. This novel is about his last days in Auvers-sur-Oise, a little town outside of Paris, not far from Paris. So this is a novel about Van Gogh in love with a young French woman, a photographer, a passionate intellectual. My most recent fiction, called The Green Hour, there was, in the period of the 1890s in Paris, people were drinking so much absinthe. They were meeting at the time of drinking absinthe, say about 6 or 7 in the afternoon before dinner, and the terraces, the cafes were filled with green bottles. That moment became known as the Green Hour, and then people would actually say, "I'll meet you at the Green Hour." The characters are, in a way, a bit Francophile. Dominique is an art historian, and her passion is for Poussin. And she wrestles with this artist, this recondite, difficult artist for her. And then there's Rex, a revolutionary. His nostalgia is for '68, although he's an American. He sees the Paris of '68 as a great moment, and a moment that he hopes will be relived again in France. And the novel takes place basically in the outskirts of Paris. It takes place in Saint-Denis, where Rex is living, where Rex has become a kind of bicycle mechanic, and where Dominique comes to live with him. So there's a kind of working class life, a life where people spend their time in cafes and not in great restaurants.
France makes more than great films, it makes great magazines about great films. By everyone's count, one of those publications is Positif, a current exhibit organized by the film department of the Museum of Modern Art, celebrates 500 issues and 50 years of the journal. While 50 films championed by the magazine unspool in December and January, the exhibit also marks the publication in English of the anthology Positif 50 Years, selections from the French Film Journal. Editor Michel Simon talks to Canapé about the pleasures of cinephilia.
Well, Positif has been going for 50 years. It's a magazine, or I would call it more even a journal or a review, which has several aims. First of all, I think it's a magazine that has championed new filmmakers all the time. I mean, it has the reputation of really discovering and setting trends, and with a very international view. Second aspect is also to look at the past. We do every month, we have a dossier about the history of cinema, because we believe that the past illuminates the present and the present helps us to rediscover the past. So this historical dimension is also very important. The third aspect is it's a polemical magazine. It was influenced by surrealism at the beginning. Several members of the crew were members of the surrealist group, so it was a very anti-establishment magazine and so on. And it left room to poetry, to painting, to music. It does not consider cinema as separate from the rest of the arts, and also separate from the world in general, from politics or all kinds of things like that. Yes, the birth of the magazine was in Lyon, but very soon, after 2 or 3 years, it moved to Paris, because it's impossible really to make a magazine outside of Paris, because France is very centralized, and Paris is the place where you can see the films, the new films, and meet the people and interview them and so on. But nevertheless, the provincial quality of Positif is very characteristic of the magazine, as well as its internationalism. It's more international and provincial than Parisian in spirit. And of course it was born from the film clubs, from the art house cinema, by young students who worked for free, and the magazine has never paid its contributors. For 50 years it was just all people who were working for free, and I think it is an example of its enthusiasm and its love of cinema. I was there for the first time 40 years ago. Some of them were there at the beginning, 50 years ago. There are very new ones who have been there for 3 years. And I think this exchange of generations, this exchange of points of view between people of very different ages is extremely fruitful, I think, and very, yes, fertilizing. Positif was, and still is, but was even more in the 50s, a very left-wing magazine with strong political commitments. against the church, which was prevalent in French cultural life, against the army, the politicians, and so on, the war in Algeria, the censorship. It was a very polemical period. And nevertheless, the Positive loved American movies, not all American movies, not indiscriminately, but at the time the left was very much under control by the Communist Party, which hated Hollywood, hated America. We thought it was possible to oppose the Algerian War and to love Sid Charisse and musical comedies, or Tex Avery and animated cartoons, or westerns, or criminal films by Robert Aldrich or John Huston. When there was the Vietnam War, most of the French reviewers disliked American films because they were under the influence of Maoism and so on, and Marxism. And Positive though it was left-wing, again we thought that it was possible to enjoy Coppola and Scorsese and Schatzberg and De Palma and Robert Altman because they were not responsible for the Vietnam War. And in fact their films were very critical about the conventional values and conservative values. The French have a big problem. They should look at themselves instead of constantly criticizing others, because they would not have attacked American cinema at the time of the Vietnam War if they had remembered that when the New Wave arrived, it was the Algerian War. The New Wave directors had nothing to do with the Algerian War. They were not responsible, the same way as Woody Allen or Robert Altman or Martin Scorsese were not responsible for the Vietnam War.
Some wounds to the national body heal with great difficulty. What the Vietnam War was to America, the Algerian War 40 years ago was to France. Its repercussions still inform daily life in France. An important work in this French national debate is the recent memoir by General Paul Sarès, a key player in French counterintelligence operations during the war. The book's American publisher, Robert L. Miller, talks to Canapé about the relevance of France's past to America's present.
The Algerian War officially started on November 1st, 1954, with the very first terrorist acts. I believe there were 7 or 8 or 9 persons killed during that first day. The entire situation came to a head in January of 1957 when General Massu decided to create a secret command to handle the terrorist attacks. And in order to break the back of the terrorist cells, he created this secret command and named Paul Sarès, who was a major at the time, as the head of this group. I think the big controversy comes from the fact that torture was the main tool of counterterrorism. And this torture that was basically approved of and possibly encouraged even by the highest instances of the government was a shock to most young Frenchmen who did not live through the period. So, whereby, you think of the period of the occupation of France with the Gestapo, and as the period where these things happened, suddenly the French people had to confront the fact that their army possibly did similar things in the context of the Algerian War. The other shocking fact of the book was that the general makes no apology. He says quite clearly he killed people, tortured them, and killed them because he was ordered to do so and it was necessary.
Nous sommes des soldats et nous avons le devoir de vaincre. Alors, pour être précis, à mon tour maintenant de poser la question. la France doit-elle rester en Algérie? Si vous répondez encore oui, vous devez en accepter toutes les conséquences nécessaires.
The war went on with several different episodes and periods, including the arrival of de Gaulle in 1958, and ended in July 1962, when France evacuated Algeria and Algeria was given its independence. And I think many of the older generation, and I consider myself part of that, have read about it, lived through it at some point, or heard about the war in Algeria or the great Arab versus European conflict, which goes beyond France and includes England and other countries. And we, since we are the cousins of the Europeans, are now involved in something very similar, because we have interests in the Middle East and North Africa just as big, maybe even larger than the colonial powers had. We are involved, and we must face many of the same problems. So this is a lesson of history, possibly a lesson for the future. Now with the Al-Qaeda September 11th, it's even greater and more vivid to the American reader to read this book, because if we want to understand the nature of terrorism and counterterrorism, I think we should study some of these situations. And this is one of the very graphic ones that unfortunately teaches you many different lessons.